Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 26th, 2023. Today we're going to take a look at the deranged figure of Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose presence continues to hover over the NATO deployment for war in Ukraine, and who is the intellectual godfather of an event which took place in Washington, D.C. yesterday, which was committed to provoking the breakup of Russia. So let's take a quick review of Brzezinski and his influence, and then we'll look at this conference that just took place. The current U.S. Foreign policy is heavily shaped by the work of one of the two architects of the post-Kennedy administration policy. Kissinger was one, of course. The other is Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was born into a Polish aristocratic family and in a town which is currently in Ukraine, but was at the time in Poland. And his thinking was shaped very much by the geopolitical doctrines of Halford Mackinder, a British subject credited with creating the doctrine of geopolitics. In 1904, Mackinder gave a speech, The Geographical Pivot of History. And over time, this became the leading approach of the British Empire to sustaining the power of the City of London and the British Empire in the world. Mackinder later described his theory as saying that who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland, that is essentially Eurasia. Who rules the heartland commands the world island, which is Eurasia, Europe, South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And who rules the heartland commands the world island and all the resources. So the whole idea was that you had to maintain a control of this outside of any regional powers. In particular, opposition from the British to any alliance between France, Germany, and Russia. And this was preceded by the Great Game, which was the battle in Afghanistan over the Central Asia, but then became a full-blown international doctrine after Mackinder's intervention, which led to World War I. Now, Brzezinski's master's thesis in 1950 was about the Russo-Soviet nationalism, the study of the various nationalities within the Soviet Union. And you'll see in a moment why this is so important. In 1970, he wrote one of his definitive works, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. And what he wrote about was the need for the advanced countries, namely Western Europe and the United States, to maintain a unified policy to be able to deal with what he expected would be instability coming from the developing sector, especially as these nations moved to break with the old binds and ties of colonial policy. Now, this was occurring at about the same time that Kissinger put forward his National Security Study Memo 200, which was designed to counter the developing sector, because he said the developing sector, because of its growing population, this is Kissinger now, would demand to keep more of a share of their resources, and that the way to combat this would be to combat population growth. This was long before Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum. Now, Brzezinski was a parallel operation with Kissinger. He was a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, whose actual founder was David Rockefeller, who was the person who was one of the owners of Kissinger. Brzezinski was the director of the Trilateral Commission from 1973 to 76. Then he went into the Carter administration as the National Security Advisor. Now, during that time, he was promoting a number of things, but most important was the attack on the Soviet Union, how to dismantle the Soviet Empire. Now, this was behind his launching of an Afghan strategy, where in July 1979, the United States started providing assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which by December of that year convinced the Soviet army that they had to move into Afghanistan to preserve their sphere of influence over that country. Those actions by Brzezinski, the arming of the Islamic tribal forces, launched what has been a war in that country that continues to the present day. And it was based on the ideas of a British historian in the Mackinder tradition, Bernard Lewis. Brzezinski called it the Arc of Crisis, that is, the area on the southern border of the Soviet Union. You could use Islamic fundamentalism as a buffer or perhaps to break up the Soviet Union. Then in 1997, he upgraded this with his book called The Grand Chessboard, America's Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. Now, during this period of time, Brzezinski was a promoter of the NATO war against Serbia in 1999. Beginning in 1998, he was a firm advocate of NATO's eastward expansion into or to the border of Russia. And in 1998, in an article he wrote, "Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire." His thinking was passed on in the State Department and in foreign policy circles to his protege, Madeleine Albright, and her protege, Antony Blinken. Now, just a couple other notes on Brzezinski. In March 2014, after the regime change coup in Ukraine, he wrote an editorial in the Washington Post titled, "Putin's Aggression in Ukraine Demands a Response." Now, he continued to play a role in the Atlantic Council, one of the leading think tanks of the Anglo-American Empire. He was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a regime change agency within the U.S. government, as well as a role in the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, why is this background so important? Well, let's jump to a conference that took place yesterday in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the Hudson Institute, titled "A New Architecture for Northern Eurasia, the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum." Now, this was centered around a speech by a Jamestown Foundation neocon named Janusz Bugajski, I think it is. Now, in his speech, he said, "It's time to seize the moment," in other words, the Ukraine situation, "and embrace the collapse of Russia." He said, it's now possible to break the Russian Federation apart and recognize parts of that break off from the Russian Federation as new ethnic and regional nations. And he said, this is the way to ensure that the falling Russian Empire never rises again. The precondition for this, of course, is that Ukraine must win the war against Russia. They need more support, and Bugajski called for bringing Ukraine into NATO now. He went on to say that the loss of Crimea and Donbass, that is, if Russia is defeated, will expose Russia's weakness and allow for other regions to break free from Moscow. So this is clearly the ghost of Brzezinski directing U.S. policy. Now, whether Biden hears the whisperings of Brzezinski's ghost or not, it's clear in the statements coming from Western leaders, including Blinken, but also including Stoltenberg of NATO and others, that this is the thinking they have. It was stated by Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, the point of the war is to weaken Russia. And why weaken Russia? Because of the vast raw material wealth of Russia, and because Russia is standing as a sovereign nation in opposition to the global reset that's underway, directed by the City of London and Wall Street. Now, what they fear is what we saw yesterday at the UN Security Council, when Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov chaired a session on and his speech was titled "The Effective Multilateralism Through the Defense of the Principles of the Charter of the United Nations." What he put forward is that it's the UN Charter which is the basis of international law, in contrast to the so-called rules-based order. And what Lavrov said that what's essential is sovereign equality of states and the indivisibility of security, which means that all nations have legitimate security interests, and these should be respected by all other sovereign nations. Now, this is the principle that Putin was putting forward before the launching of the special military operation, when he attempted for 8 long years to convince NATO and the United States to stop supporting the attacks on the Donbass by the coup regime in Kiev. Now, in opposition to what Lavrov presented at the United Nations Security Council, were the babblings of the European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, the man who infamously stuck both feet in his mouth when he said Europe is a garden and it has to be protected from the savages who are overrunning Europe. Borrell insisted that nations must take sides in the Ukraine war and against China, that they can't afford to be neutral or pro-Russian. And Borrell is now calling for the European nations to send their navies to patrol the Taiwan Strait. So here we see again the war hawks in the Brzezinski mode, up against the interests of sovereign nations worldwide. Now, we'll have more on this in the next couple of days. In fact, I'm going to include in the description section a link to the dialogue I'll be conducting with Helga Zepp-LaRouche today. And you can participate in that. You can click on it. You can send in questions or comments, and we're happy to have your input. Also, for your fun, I'm going to include the latest intervention, a link to the latest intervention by Jose Vega, who challenged the editors of a number of mainstream press for their lies and refusal to cover the truth when it comes to the Ukraine war and the conditions that are being paved for a World War III, possible nuclear war. Jose stood up to them, challenged them, and all they could do was drag him out of the meeting room because they couldn't answer him. So thanks for joining me today. Remember the interview with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and your potential to ask some questions, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.